They tell a story of this Jew in the former Soviet Union in Russia in the days of the height of communism, when the Iron Curtain was up. So this old Jew, 95-year-old Jew, he's sitting on a park bench in Russia, and he's reading a Hebrew-Russian dictionary. When a KGB officer walks up to him and says, "What are you doing, sir? Don't you know it's forbidden to study Judaism in Russia?" And the old Jew looks at the KGB officer and he says, "Officer, I'm not studying Judaism, I'm just learning a language. This is Hebrew, it's the language of the Jewish people in Israel." And the KGB officer starts laughing and says, "You foolish old Jew, your whole life you've been trying to immigrate to Israel and we've never let you go. What makes you think now that at your old age of 95 you're finally going to get a visa to go to Israel?" And the old Jew looks at the KGB officer and says, "Actually, I have no illusions that you're ever going to let me go to Israel. But the reason I'm studying Hebrew is because I'm getting old and I'm going to die soon, and I heard that in heaven they speak Hebrew. So I'm preparing myself for heaven." At that point, the Russian KGB officer says to the Jew, "And what makes you so sure you're going to heaven? Maybe you're going to go to hell." And the old Jew looks at the officer and says, "That's not a problem, officer, because I already know Russian." The Jewish people have had the longest and the most tortured existence of persecution and suffering. And yet some of the greatest comedians have come from the Jewish people. Isn't it ironic? And perhaps the reason for that is because, as they say, sometimes in life you could either cry about it or laugh about it. And perhaps as Jews we've often chosen to laugh about it rather than cry about it. However, the question is there ever a time where joking about a situation may be inappropriate or premature? And this question came to mind this week, where after the terrible superstorm Sandy, which hit the Northeast, devastating so many communities, causing death count to about 100 people here in this country and many more in the Bahamas and elsewhere, when the late night comics went on with their daily routine of humor and joke making. And to give you a few examples of some of the jokes that were made by David Letterman the night after the storm, where he said, "You know, for the first time in over 100 years, the stock market has been closed for 2 days." And he said, "It's the first time in my life that I felt that my money was safe." Or when he went on to say that New York has not experienced such a power outage ever since the Yankees lost the playoffs. And finally he said that New Jersey was hit so hard by the storm that it actually knocked over Governor Chris Christie. And I wonder to myself whether at a moment when so many people are suffering, where they're literally up into their necks in water, if that's appropriate to be making jokes at such a time. It's one thing when you've gained a little distance between the tragedy and the times to look back and try to laugh. But while people are still in the midst of suffering, is it at an appropriate time? And this week's Torah portion indeed talks about the subject of laughter. We're told a story in this week's Torah portion about the 3 angels who arrive at the tent of Abraham. And of course they come bearing good news. And our rabbis learn one of the most important lessons about shalom bayis, about maintaining peace in a home, from the story of this week's Torah portion. The Torah tells us how when the 3 angels arrive, they notify Abraham the good news. And they say to Abraham, "We will return to you at this time next year. V'hinei ben l'Sarah ishtecha, and behold, your wife Sarah will be carrying a child, a son. V'Sarah shomat Pesach Ohel, Sarah hears the news from the angels by the entrance of the tent from where she was standing." Now we know the Torah goes on to say that Abraham and Sarah were old, well on in years, and the manner of women had ceased to be with Sarah. And then the Torah says, "Vatitzchak Sarah b'kirba lemor." Sarah laughed at herself, saying, "After I have withered, shall I again have delicate skin? And my husband is old. How can I possibly have a child?" And so she laughs. And at that point, God comes to Abraham and says to Abraham, Lama zet tzachaka Sarah? Why is it that Sarah laughed, saying, shall I in truth bear a child, though I have aged? Is anything beyond Hashem? At the appointed time I will return to you at this time next year, and Sarah will have a son. And our rabbis say that if you notice when Sarah laughed, she said, how can I have a child when my skin has withered? Va'adoni zaken, and my husband is old. But yet when God came to Abraham to reprimand Sarah and question, how can Sarah laugh? Is there anything beyond God? God changes the words of Sarah and says, Sarah laughed and said, how can I have a child va'ani zakanti, when I am so old? Because God understood that if he came to Abraham and said, Abraham, you know what your wife said? She laughed and she said, how can I have a child when my husband is so old? Well, that will cause a little friction in the marriage. Abraham will confront Sarah and say, Sarah, what did you say? That I'm too old? What about you? Have you looked in the mirror? You're no spring chicken yourself. What do you think? I'm too old. What about you? So therefore, to keep shalom bayis, to keep peace in the household, not to create marital strife, God alters the truth, rephrases the words of Sarah, and says, Sarah questioned if she could have a child, saying that she is too old. Is there anything beyond God? Why did she laugh? And indeed, we see that there was some strife, because after that, Abraham confronts Sarah and says, why did you laugh? And the Torah tells us, Sarah denied it and said, no, I didn't laugh. So you see that it led to some friction, but yet God minimized it by changing Sarah's words to say, Va'ani zakanti, I am too old, not my husband. And I would like to ask 4 questions on this story. The first question is, while it's a beautiful lesson never to say something that would offend the spouse, repeat something that one spouse said that may offend the other spouse, not to cause friction in a marriage, the bigger question is, why did God go to Abraham altogether? After all, the verse said, Vatitzchak Sarah bikirba. Sarah laughed inwardly. Abraham didn't hear Sarah laugh. Only God, who knows the inner thoughts of a person, knew that Sarah had laughed within and questioned, how can I have a child when my skin has withered and my husband is old? So why did God have to confront Abraham and tell Abraham that Sarah laughed, which will always only create tension in the marriage? Shouldn't, if you want to confront Sarah, you could ask, God could have gone to Sarah and said, Sarah, why did you laugh? But is it appropriate to go complain to a spouse about something that their husband or wife did? That's not the way to create respect and love in a marriage. So why does God even go to Abraham? Why doesn't he just go directly to Sarah if God was unhappy with Sarah's response? The second question is, if you remember from last week's Torah portion, the portion of Lech Lecha, we find the following story. God said to Abraham, in last week's Torah portion, Sarai ishtecha lot sikra et shema Sarai. Your wife Sarah, no longer shall her name be Sarai, but rather her new name should be Sarah. Why should her new name be Sarah? Because I'm going to bless you, and I'm going to give you a child, and he will become a great nation. And so God gave the same promise to Abraham in last week's Torah portion, that they will have a child in their old age. And of course we know that Abraham at the time was 99 years old, and his wife Sarah was 90 years old. And what was the response of Abraham in last week's Torah portion? It said, Vayipol Avraham al panav. Abraham fell on his face, Vayitzchak, and he laughed. Vayomer bilibo, he said in his heart, Halaben meya shana yivaled, can a man at the age of 100 give birth? Vim Sarah, and my wife Sarah, habat tishim shana teled, how can she give birth at the age of 90? And so Abraham's response to the news in last week's Torah portion was identical to Sarah's. He also laughed. and questioned whether he and his wife at the age of 190, he being 100, his wife being 90, can give birth to a child. And furthermore, Abraham goes on to say to God, God, Lu Yishmael Yichyel Lefanecha. If only Ishmael will turn out to be a nice Jewish boy. Forget about a newborn baby. That's impossible. At least Ishmael should turn out okay. And God says, no. Vayomer Elokim, no. Aval Sarah Ishtecha Yoledet Lecha Ben, no. She will have a new child. And what will you call him? You should call him Yitzchak. Because Yitzchak means laughter. Because you laughed, the name of the baby should be Yitzchak. And so the question is, in our Torah portion, God takes Sarah to task. Why did Sarah laugh? Does she not have faith? Is anything beyond God? But yet in last week's Torah portion, when Abraham did the same thing, he laughed on the news that he would have a child, God doesn't reprimand Abraham. Why does God reprimand Sarah and not Abraham in last week's Torah portion when he laughed? The third question is that we all know that a joke is only funny if you haven't heard it before. Once you know the punchline, it's not funny anymore. Because the way a joke works is you build anxiety as you hear the joke, the story, and you don't know where it's going. And then when you hear the punchline, there's a release of laughter. But if you already know the punchline, there's no building of anxiety and tension. So of course you don't laugh. So the question is, in rabbinical school they taught us, they said that, if you tell a joke, you shouldn't repeat it for 3 years because people tend to remember jokes. So you have to wait 3 years before you recycle a joke. But a story, they said, people don't remember stories that long. So you can get away with repeating a story once a year. However, they said, Dvar Torahs, people hardly remember. You can repeat it twice in the same sermon. So the question is, if Sarah laughed when she heard the news that she was going to have a baby, what does that tell you? It tells you that obviously it's the first time she's hearing this. And that's why it caused her to giggle, to laugh at even the thought that she would have a child at the age of 90. So obviously when Abraham heard the news in last week's Torah portion from God that he would have a child with Sarah, he obviously never told Sarah about that conversation with God. Because had he told her, she would have laughed then and she wouldn't laugh now when the angels told them, because it wouldn't be funny because she had already heard this news before. And the question is, how could it be that if God came to Abraham and told him that finally after all these years of marriage, they were finally going to have a child in their old age, how is it that Abraham forgot to tell his wife that news? Sometimes husbands forget to tell their wives certain things that happen, and they say, why didn't you tell me? Oh, a little detail that wasn't so important, I forgot to mention it to you. But how do you fail to tell your wife the greatest news of all, that God revealed himself to you and told you you're going to have a child in your old age? It's not a minor detail to be forgotten. Furthermore, when God came to Abraham and said, you're going to have a baby, he said, therefore, your wife's name should be changed. No longer will it be Sarai with a yud at the end, it should be Sarah. God took his letter Hey from the name of Hashem and put it in Sarah's name as a preparation for the blessing of having a child. So the question is, imagine what happened. Abraham comes home that night and suddenly he's saying, honey, Sarah, how are you? And she's like, Sarah, why are you calling me Sarah? My name is Sarai. So he had to give some explanation to his wife for the fact that now he's no longer calling her Sarai, which is the name he's called her for all these years. Suddenly he's changing her name. But yet he failed to tell her the most important part of the message, that the reason for the changing of the name was because she was going to have a child. And finally, the fourth question. We know that all of the patriarchs were given names by God. Avram was Avram until God gave him the letter Hey and he became Avraham. Yitzchak, as we see here, even before he was born, God said, and you shall name him Yitzchak. And Yaakov, of course, had a wrestling match with the angel, and the angel said, as a blessing, your name will be Yisroel. But it was later God who came to Jacob and confirmed it and said, no longer shall your name be Jacob, your name will be Yisroel. But when you look at Abraham and Jacob, Abraham and Yaakov, who was named Yisroel, their names have great significance, importance. Avraham means Av Hamon Gayim. You will be a father of many nations. That's a very weighty, significant name. It has substance to it. That the Jewish people are a father to many nations, as we see today, many religions that were born out of Judaism. That is a name that has meaning in every generation for the Jewish people. That we always know we are the father of all religions. And the same thing is with the name Yisroel. Yisroel means to wrestle with God. You're a prince of God, Sarkel. Once again, a name that has eternal importance for the Jew. But what about the name Yitzchak, which means laughter? It seems to be a name that was given based on one incident. The fact that Abraham laughed when he heard the news, and subsequently Sarah laughs. But what message, what importance, what depth does this name carry for future generations? You know, when you look for a name for your child, you look for a name that has great meaning, inspiration to it. This seems like a throwaway name, Laughter, because he laughed, we'll name him Laughter. Like naming your child Apple or something. What's the meaning to the word Yitzchak for future generations of Jews? One of the stories in this week's Torah portion, of course, is the famous story of Sodom, where God tells Abraham he's going to destroy the city of Sodom. And Abraham negotiates for their survival, but ultimately he cannot find 10 righteous people, and so God goes ahead with his plan to destroy the city of Sodom and Amorah. And of course, 2 of the 3 angels make their way to Sodom to rescue Lot and his family. And we all know the story that they come to Lot and they tell him it's time to flee because God is going to destroy the cities. And at first he's hesitant, he doesn't know if he should go, if he should not go. He goes to talk to his son-in-laws, they say, we're not going with you, we're staying here. And ultimately he takes his wife and his 2 daughters and they flee the city. But as they're fleeing the city, the angels say to Lot and his wife and his daughters, do not look back at the city as it's being destroyed. And we all know what happens. The wife of Lot cannot resist. It's called rubbernecking. And she has to see what it looks like. And so she turns back to see the city going up in flames. And at that point the Torah says, Vatihi netziv melech. She was turned into a pillar of salt. Until this very day in Israel, a good tour guide can take you to the place where you can see Lot's wife as a pillar of salt. And the question is, this is a very odd way to punish Lot's wife. By turning her into a pillar of salt. She's the only person in the Bible her death comes about by her turning into a pillar of salt. What's the meaning behind the fact that as a punishment for looking back at the destruction of the cities, God turned her into a pillar of salt? And so Rashi gives his interpretation, and Rashi says that the reason she was turned into a pillar of salt was because she was very stingy. As we know, the people of Sodom were miserly. And when her guests came and she served them bread, she wouldn't even give them salt with their bread. And so as a punishment for not serving salt to her guests, she turned into a pillar of salt. But the question is, obviously if she didn't give her guests salt, she most probably didn't give them a lot of other things to eat. So why was she turned into salt? Maybe she should have been turned into something else that she didn't feed her guests. And so another deeper reason given as to why she was turned into a pillar of salt, because it's a message and it's a lesson. And the lesson is as follows. There are times in life where in our past we have devastation, we have destruction. And oftentimes people tend to look back at their past mistakes, their wrongdoing, the unfortunate situations in their lives that perhaps left havoc and destruction. And therefore the Torah is telling us that when we flee from our past, when we try to move forward with our lives, we have to remember not to get fixated on the past. Because if we look back and we remain staring at the past, unfortunately, we can turn into a pillar of salt. If we are consumed with the negative past experiences in our lives, then we become paralyzed, and we become filled like a pillar of salt with bitterness over the past. And as a result of that, we're unable to move forward to a brighter tomorrow with future, with hope, and with optimism. And that's why the metaphor of salt is used. Salt is something that when you put a little bit of salt into your food, it enhances the food. It enhances the flavor. It makes it more tasty. But if you put too much salt, it spoils the dish and it becomes unedible. And the same thing is true in life. Everyone has past mistakes that they regret. Everyone has experiences in the past that were unfortunate and negative. We all have a somewhat degree of devastation, destruction in our past. But if we are too consumed with it, then we make our lives bitter. And as a result of that, we lose the opportunities for the future. As someone once said, that when we invest too much of the present into the past, we lose the future. Or as someone once said, yesterday is history. Tomorrow is a mystery. Today is a gift from God, and that's why it's called the present. What happened yesterday cannot be undone. Yes, we have to remember the past. We have to learn the lessons of the past. We need a pinch of salt on our table. And the rabbis tell us in the Medrash that one of the reasons why we dip our bread in salt is to remember the story of Lot's wife. Why? Because the lesson is we need a little bit of salt, a little bit of regret, remorse, to remember the lessons of the past, not to repeat them. But if we're too overwhelmed with the salt, then it embitters our lives and not allowing us to move forward. And if there's ever a people that understood this message, it's the Jewish people. The Jewish people have the most bitter past, a past filled with suffering and persecution. But the genius of the Jewish people is that we never became stuck in the past. Yes, we remember all the sad days on our calendars. Yes, we have a pinch of salt on our table to remember our past sufferings because we need to learn the lessons of history. But we don't become stuck in the past. The Jewish people would have a right to mourn for the rest of their lives, just for the 6 million that died in our generation alone. But the greatness of the Jewish people is that we were always able to pick ourselves up and embrace the future with hope, with joy, with optimism. That despite all of our tsaras, we're able to lift our glasses constantly and say l'chaim, and to rejoice and to celebrate life, not allowing the past to define our future. Been many stories over the past week, many horrific stories as a result of the storm. But one story I read was about a family in Staten Island, in a little town called Tottenville, the Dresch family. And the Dresch family lived on Yetman Street in Tottenville. There was George, the father, Patricia, the mother, and their 13-year-old daughter, Angela. And when they heard the forecast of the storm, and they were warned and told they should leave, evacuate before the storm, they discussed it amongst themselves, and they decided that they were going to stay put, that they were not going to leave. They were going to ride out the storm. Why? Because last August, when Hurricane Irene came through, they followed the instructions, they evacuated, and when they returned to their home, they found that their home had been robbed. And so having been burnt by that experience, they decided that this time they would not leave, they would stay behind and protect their possessions and their home. Well, tragically, the storm came and completely destroyed their home, killing George, the father, and his 13-year-old daughter, Angela, and leaving the wife, Patricia, in ICU struggling, fighting for her life in the hospital as she's mourning the tragic, unfathomable loss of her husband and her teenage daughter. Sometimes we allow negative past experiences to shape our decisions in the present, and tragically, we lose our future. Yes, we need to learn from the mistakes of the past, and maybe extra measures should have been taken to protect our home. But never allow a negative past experience to hold you back from securing a bright and beautiful future. Never allow it to embitter you to the point where you make a foolish decision, where you're unwilling to flee when the time to flee has come. As Lot's family had to struggle with that same decision. And perhaps now we could understand the story of Sarah and Abraham's laughter. When God comes to Abraham and says, through the angels, your wife is going to have a baby. And Sarah laughs and says, how can I have a baby? My skin has withered, my husband is old, I'm 90, my husband's almost 100. And she laughs. And God comes and says to Abraham, why did Sarah laugh? God is not reprimanding Sarah, but God is actually reprimanding Abraham. Because God is saying to Abraham, why is it that Sarah laughed? Obviously, I realize that you never delivered my message to your wife. You never told her the news that I gave to you, that you will have a baby. Why didn't you tell her? If she's laughing now, it means it's the first time she's hearing this. Why didn't you tell her the promise I gave you that you would have a child? And of course, the reason why Abraham didn't tell his wife was because Abraham figured, my wife and I, we've been struggling our whole life to have a child. We've been going to doctors our whole life. We've only had one disappointment after another setback, another letdown. My wife has been gone through so much suffering already. She's in her old age now. She's made her peace. She's accepted her lot. Why would I want to get her hopes up again and tell her she's going to have a child and she'll get all excited, and then, God forbid, there'll be a letdown and she'll be disappointed again, she'll be depressed again. Let me spare her that anguish. Let me not tell her. And God says to Abraham, Abraham, have you become so stuck in the past, so bitter, that you're unable to have hope and optimism for the future? That even when I give you the most exciting news, the greatest promise that you're going to have a child, you fear to tell your wife because you're not completely confident that it's going to become true? Because you're afraid that the past will continue to repeat itself? You've lost faith in a beautiful tomorrow and a possibility for a miracle, for something great to happen? Have you lost your hope, your optimism, your faith, to the point that you would not tell your wife the news? And so therefore, God is not reprimanding Sarah. God is reprimanding Abraham and saying, Abraham, why is it that Sarah laughed? As a Jew, you must always be optimistic. You always have to look to the future with confidence, with hope, hatikva, the hope of the Jewish people. Because without that, you cannot be a Jew. And that is the meaning of the name Yitzchak. God says, you know what? When you have a child, you shall name this child Yitzchak. Because the name laughter embodies the essence of the story of the Jewish people. What God is saying to Abraham is that rather than the laughter being a laughter of sarcasm, of cynicism, laughing, like it's impossible, it'll never happen, may your laughter become the laughter of true joy. And indeed, when Sarah has her child in the Parsha, what does she say? Kol hashamea Yitzchak li. Everyone who hears the news that I had a child at 90 years old will laugh with me. You see, there's two ways to laugh. Sometimes you could laugh at someone, or you could laugh with someone. God says, no longer will the laughter be the laughter of laughing at my promise. You will laugh and rejoice with my promise, with the realization of my promise. And that's the story of the Jewish people. Like any good joke, there's a building of anxiety, of tension, of nervousness, like in the story of the Russian Jew and with the KGB officer. What's going to happen? As you hear the story, you're getting worried about this poor Jew. What are they going to do to him? And finally, when there is that punchline, you start laughing because you realize there's nothing to fear. The story of the Jewish people has been a long story of anxiety, of fear, of worry, a story of great tension. But every time there is a punchline, and the punchline is the laughter, the joy that comes with the hand of Hashem, with the miraculous salvation that the Jewish people inevitably always have seen. And that is why in the Shir HaMalot we say that when Mashiach will come, Az Yimalei Sechok Pinu, our mouths will be filled with laughter. Not the laughter that sometimes Jews have when they hear about Mashiach. Yeah, Mashiach is going to come. It's a joke. It's a punchline, like it's never going to happen. But the laughter that comes from the realization that indeed it has come true. And that is why perhaps more than any other people, the Jewish people have produced more comedians than any other nation. Because we know the feeling of anxiety and fear, but then we know the laughter that follows after that. And the greater the tension, the greater the laughter when the laughter comes. And that's the story of Isaac, coming at the old age of Sarah and Abraham, producing great laughter because they waited so long for that baby. And that's the story of the binding of Isaac. With the great fear and trepidation, Abraham lifts the knife to slaughter his son, and then the angel comes and says, no, do not slaughter the lad. And once again, there's a release, there's great laughter. And that has been the story of the Jewish people in our generation after the greatest tragedy of the Holocaust, the laughter and the joy of coming home to Eretz Yisrael. And that will be the ultimate laughter of the Jewish people with the coming of Mashiach, which King David predicts and prophesies when he says, Az Yimalei Sechok Pinu, our mouths will be filled with laughter. And so the lesson of the word Yitzchak is that as a people, both as a nation, as Americans, and as a Jewish people, we always have to be able to laugh. We always have to remain hopeful and positive and optimistic. We can never become so marred in sarcasm and negativity and pain that we can no longer have the ability to laugh. Where we no longer have the ability to look to the future as being bright and hopeful. Where we become so entrenched in our negative experiences that we've lost all hope for a better tomorrow. And indeed, this week there's a lot of tension in this country. There's a lot of anxiety. And on Wednesday morning, not only one of the two candidates are going to wake up with a big disappointment, but as the polls show, the country is split right down the middle. Half the country is going to wake up deeply disappointed. But the lesson of Yitzchak is that we cannot become cynical and sarcastic and pessimistic. We cannot make the jokes of pessimism saying, we're doomed, our country is lost, it's going to go to rot, we have no future ahead of us. We have to be able to remain positive and hopeful. And we have to realize that yes, we tried our best, we stood up for our values, we voted what we believe was right for this country. And we should stand up for what we believe in. But when the results come in ultimately, we cannot be bitter. We have to make ourselves better. And we have to have hope that together we will be able to laugh and have happy, joyous times ahead of us. Someone once said that man proposes and God disposes. Sometimes we think we know what's best, but we have to have trust in Hashem. We have to have faith that God ultimately runs the world. And after we've done our best, we've voted our conscience, now we trust God's plan. I would just like to conclude with the following question. If there were three candidates running for election, candidate A is a person who associates with crooked politicians and consults with astrologists. He's had 2 mistresses, and he also chain smokes and drinks 8 to 10 martinis a day. Candidate B was kicked out of office twice, sleeps until noon, used opium in college, and drinks a quart of whiskey every evening. And candidate C is a decorated war hero. He's a vegetarian, doesn't smoke, drinks an occasional beer, and hasn't had any extramarital affairs. Which of these three candidates would you vote for? And my friends, had you voted for candidate A, you would have elected Franklin D. Roosevelt. Had you voted for candidate B, you would have elected Winston Churchill. And had you voted for candidate C, you would have voted for Adolf Hitler. My friends, we do our part, but ultimately we trust Hashem. And the morning after this election, let us unite with laughter, with joy, with hope, with optimism. And rather than become pessimistic and cynical and negative, let us unite as one nation. Let us trust the decision which our people, confirmed by God, has been made. And let us laugh and be optimistic that yes, together as a people, we will have joy and laughter ahead of us. Thank you.